Surviving the night of the Titanic, April 1912. The Atlantic Ocean is silent. The darkness of the night settles over a sea as smooth as glass. The sky is clear. The stars are bright. There is no wind. And precisely because of this, no one senses the danger. The Titanic moves forward as the largest, safest, and most ambitious ship humanity has ever built. A ship said to be unsinkable. But that night, no one asked the real question. A ship can sink. But what happens when a human sinks? 11:40 p.m. A tremor, no explosion, no sound of impact, just a faint vibration. Many passengers don't even notice it. Some turn in their beds. Some continue chatting in the lounges. Some laugh. But beneath the ship, the metal has already been torn open. From this moment on, there are two Titanics. One where the lights are still on, music is playing, and hope remains. Another that is quietly dying, counting its final minutes. And caught between these two Titanics are those who will survive. Now let me tell you something that is rarely mentioned. Those who survived the Titanic do not remember that night as a rescue. For them, it was not a beginning, a victory, a miracle. That night was the moment their lives split in two, because survival is not always a good thing. There were people who boarded lifeboats, people waiting while shivering in the cold, people watching those left behind, and the worst part, hearing the voices of those who stayed, screams, the sound of bodies hitting the water. And then, silence. When the Titanic sank, the ocean eventually calmed, but the minds of the survivors never did. Because the human brain does not register such moments as finished. It replays them, every night, in every silence, with every sound of waves, and that is why the real story of Titanic's survivors begins when the ship goes down. According to official records, 2,224 people were aboard. More than 1,500 lost their lives. Around 700 survived. But there is something these numbers do not tell. Not a single one of those 700 was the same person afterward. Some felt guilt for surviving. Some were shunned for surviving. Some withdrew into themselves. And some, despite surviving, never truly left that night. Let me ask you this. When a ship is sinking, what is harder? Surviving, or surviving and continuing to live? Because the people you're about to hear about kept breathing, but something inside them remained in that ocean. And the first story begins with the highest-ranking officer to survive the Titanic. An officer, a seaman, a man who survived but never escaped that night. His name was Charles Lightoller. And his story is not merely a survival story, it is the story of a silent collapse. Charles Lightoller. The surviving officer, Charles Herbert Lightoller, the highest-ranking officer to survive the Titanic. But this title was never carried like a medal. It was carried like a burden. Lightoller was on duty that night, a seaman, disciplined, rule-bound, and above all, a man who followed orders. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, Lightoller was on the starboard side. At first, like many others, he underestimated the situation, because in seamanship, such vibrations were not unusual. But as minutes passed, the truth surfaced. The water was rising, and this time metal would not hold. The order given to Lightoller was clear: women and children first. But there was a small yet vital distinction. Some officers understood this as, women and children have priority. Lightoller understood it as, only women and children. That difference decided the fate of hundreds. Lightoller did not allow a single adult man to board the lifeboats under his command. Even when the boats were half empty, he turned men away. The men behind him begged. Some shouted, some cried, some waited in silence. But to Lightoller, a rule was a rule. And that night, rules collided with conscience. As the Titanic sank, Lightoller was still on duty. One of the final lifeboats capsized. In the chaos, Lightoller suddenly found himself in the water. A cold so intense it froze thought itself. But he did not die. By sheer chance, he clung to an overturned boat. Hours later, on the brink of freezing, he was rescued. He survived. But here is what matters. Lightoller never described that night as a success. because he knew the boats could have been full, but they weren't. He survived, but the hundreds of men he left behind did not. When the inquiry began, Lightoller gave his testimony, calm, precise, rule-bound. That was the order, he said, and technically, he was right. But the public never fully saw him as a hero, neither fully guilty nor fully innocent, just a survivor. And sometimes that is the hardest role of all. Years passed. Lightoller could never leave the sea behind. He served in World War I, worked on new ships, faced new storms, but the Titanic was always there, in his dreams, in silence, in moments of decision. Later in life, he would say, "Surviving the Titanic was not a reward for me, it was a debt." That single sentence says everything, because Lightoller never forgave himself, not once. He never debated whether he was right or wrong. He knew he had made a choice, and he was condemned to live with it. But his story does not end there. Years later, during World War II, he did something remarkable. At the age of 60, he took his own small boat to join the Dunkirk evacuation. Under bombs, under fire. No one asked him to, but he went. Some called it heroism. Others wondered, perhaps Lightoller was trying to finish something left incomplete on the Titanic. Perhaps he was carrying the weight of the men he turned away that night. And perhaps just once he wanted to say to himself, "This time, I did everything I could." Charles Lightoller spoke very little about the Titanic until his death. He avoided interviews, gave no details, chose silence, because some moments cannot be explained with words. They are only carried. Masabumi Hosono. The man punished for surviving Masabumi Hosono. The only Japanese passenger to survive the Titanic. But this sentence was never a source of pride. On the contrary, it became a stain. Hosono was a government official returning home from duty in Russia. Boarding the Titanic was not luxury for him. It was a return from service. He did not attend parties, did not walk the grand halls. He remained quiet. But that night, silence disappeared. As the Titanic began to sink, Hosono was pulled into the chaos like everyone else. Lifeboats were being prepared. Women and children first. In every language, those words meant the same thing. At first, Hosono stepped back, because in Japanese culture, honor comes before life. But as minutes passed, reality became clear. The ship was sinking, and at the last moment, 2 empty spaces appeared in a lifeboat. An officer shouted, "2 more!" Hosono hesitated. That hesitation split his life in 2. Then, he stepped into the boat. As the Titanic pulled away from him, he looked back. Lights, music, people. And moments later, everything vanished. Hosono survived. But the story did not end there, because the real disaster began on land. When he returned to Japan, the press was waiting. But the headlines were not, "The Japanese survivor." They read, "The man who lived dishonorably." Newspapers accused him of taking the place of women and children. Despite no evidence, facts did not matter. Society wanted a symbol, and Hosono became it. He lost his job, was ostracized, forced into a quiet life with his family. For years, he lived as if he had committed a crime. And the most painful part, he could not tell his story, because every word was used against him. Hosono had to defend himself for surviving, but society refused to listen. And here, a heavy question emerges. Does surviving a disaster make someone innocent? Or is survival itself a crime? Hosono lived with this question until his death. It is said that in his diary, he once wrote, "I wish I had not survived. Perhaps then I would have been forgiven." This sentence summarizes the minds of many Titanic survivors. Because for some people, death feels more merciful than life. Years after Hosono's death, Japan officially cleared his name, but it was too late. Reputation does not return after death. Violet Jessop, the unending night of the unsinkable woman. Violet Jessop, a woman who survived the Titanic. But that was not her only escape from disaster. Violet Jessop was a life the ocean tried to take again and again, and failed. She entered maritime work at a young age, not out of romance, but out of necessity. Her family was poor, her mother was ill, Money was needed, and the sea offered work. She first worked on the RMS Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship. Ironically, the Olympic was also involved in an accident, but Violet survived. Then, she transferred to the Titanic. 1912. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, Violet was on duty. She tried to calm passengers. She smiled, because the crew had been taught, do not show panic. People are watching you. But inside, she was afraid too. An officer handed Violet a baby. Take this, he said. Get into the lifeboat. Violet held the baby in her arms. She boarded the lifeboat and left the Titanic behind. Hours later, as they waited in the freezing water, the baby was still in her arms. When they were rescued, a woman approached and took the baby, without saying a word. Her identity was never known. Violet never saw the baby again. That detail stayed with her for life. After the Titanic, Violet could have left the sea, but she didn't, because life offered her no alternative. Years later, during World War I, she served as a nurse aboard the HMHS Britannic, a hospital ship, until it struck a mine. The ship flooded rapidly. This time, escape was even more chaotic. Lifeboats were pulled toward the spinning propellers. Violet was forced to jump into the sea. As she jumped, she struck her head violently. She lost consciousness. But once again, she survived. Later, doctors found an old fracture in her skull, a memory of that moment. Violet Jessup survived 3 major maritime disasters: Olympic, Titanic, Britannic. That is why they called her the unsinkable woman. But this nickname only tells part of the truth, because Violet suffered from insomnia her entire life. The sound of the sea startled her. At night, she heard screams in her dreams. She never truly found peace. Years later, she wrote her memoirs, but some things she deliberately left out, because some moments cannot be written. They only live inside a person. Violet Jessup lived a long life, but she never truly left the Titanic, because some nights never let you go. The living dead, those who could not move on when the Titanic sank. Not only did more than 1,500 people die that night, some survived, but in truth they died that night as well. Because surviving the Titanic was not salvation for everyone. For some, it marked the beginning of a long collapse. This section is about people whose names are rarely remembered, but whose stories were the heaviest, because officially they are listed as survivors. But life did not give them a second chance. Jack Thayer. He survived but could not forgive himself. Jack Thayer was 17 years old, a first-class passenger, the son of a wealthy family. But that night, wealth meant nothing. As the ship sank, he fell into the freezing water. For hours, he drifted between life and death. At the last moment, he clung to a lifeboat and survived. But he never forgot the people struggling in the water, the voices asking for help, and then silence. Years later, Jack wrote his memories of the Titanic. They are considered among the darkest and most realistic accounts of the disaster. But writing did not heal him. He struggled with depression for years. In 1945, after losing his wife, Jack Thayer ended his life. 33 years after the Titanic. But he had never truly left that night. Charles Joughin, the man who would not die. Charles Joughin was the Titanic's chief baker. That night, he was intoxicated, and that saved his life. He fell into the freezing water, but hypothermia set in much later than expected. He stayed in the water for hours and survived. He became known as the man who would not die. But internally, and it was the opposite, he struggled with alcohol for the rest of his life. After the Titanic, he could never work at sea the same way again, and he died quietly, forgotten. The silence in the lifeboats. Many survivors later admitted one thing. In the lifeboats, no one wanted to speak, because everyone was thinking the same thing. I am here, but they are not. Some heard the screams for the rest of their lives. Some drowned those sounds in alcohol. Some never spoke at all, but all of them carried the same weight. The invisible wreckage of the Titanic. The wreck of the Titanic lies on the ocean floor, but the true wreckage was inside people. Trauma, guilt, and unanswered questions. Why did I survive? For some, this question became a lifelong punishment. And that is why the story of Titanic's survivors continued long after the ship sank. Survival was not enough. The invisible destruction after rescue. Surviving the Titanic did not mean a happy ending for everyone. For some, the hardest part began after stepping onto land. Because that night, not only a ship sank, identities, dreams, and futures sank with it. The ocean is silent, but it remembers when the Titanic sank, the ocean closed, the waves calmed, the stars remained, but nothing truly ended. Because that night, more than a ship sank, unfinished lives did too. Those who survived returned to the world, but some of them never truly left the Titanic. And perhaps that is why the Titanic is still sinking. Every time it is told, every time it is remembered.